Avoiding plagiarism. You have found several sources for your project and plan to use them in your presentation and as part of the written portion of the assignment. You know enough about plagiarism to know that you must give an author credit. This is where things can get tricky. There are essentially three ways to research material to avoid plagiarism. Method number one, summary. You have found a great passage from a source that covers some of the material you want to have in your presentation. However, the passage is very long and you do not want to have to put the entire passage in a quote. You definitely do not want to plagiarize. A summary might be a good option for you. A summary is a short restatement of material in your own words. It should be much shorter than the actual material being used. For example, a summary of an entire chapter can often be summarized in about a paragraph. The goal of a summary is to mention all the main points so the reader has a general idea about the material without getting into all the details. The idea here is to put the material in your own words and give credit to the source. Let's look at a simple example. The following material is from Mary Lou Considine's Climate Change Will Force the Relocation of Animal Species. Moving species for conservation purposes is not new. More than 200 translocations and reintroductions of 42 vertebrate species have been carried out in Australia since European settlement. However, all relocations to date have been carried out in response to tangible threats such as introduced pests or diseases, stock grazing, land clearing, or hydroelectricity works. Under current environmental regulation, particularly the Federal Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation, or EPBC Act from 1999, there is no provision for relocating species in response to climate change. Yet scientists point out that the unprecedented speed of anthropogenic climate change will outpace the adaptive capacity of many species. Rapid climate change has already caused changes to distribution of many plants and animals, leading in some cases to extinctions. And scientists predict entire ecosystems such as cloud forests and coral reefs could disappear by the end of the century. Late last year, in 2010, the Terrestrial Biodiversity Adaptation Research Network, funded through the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility, NCCARF, ran a workshop at which ecologists and policymakers debated the environmental, ethical, and policy aspects of managed relocation. Workshop participants concluded that managed relocation, quote, is not a panacea to climate change adaptation for biodiversity and is pointless without a substantial commitment to mitigation, ongoing management of existing threats, and a belief in the community that biodiversity can and should be conserved, unquote. Macquarie University's Professor Leslie Hughes, a commissioner with the recently established Climate Commission and a co-convener of the Terrestrial Biodiversity Adaptation Research Network, agrees the approach should be seen as a, quote, option of last resort. Now let's look at a possible summary. As Mary Lou Considine notes in her examination of animal relocations, some animal species have been moved from one environment to another to save the species. However, this has never been done as a result of climate change or global warming. Many scientists argue that this activity may become necessary if climate change continues. Unfortunately, there is no guarantee that transporting an animal species will solve the problems involved. It should be only done if no choices are available. Considine. Note that the summary is much shorter and gives the author credit at the end. It also does not use the language from the source. One way of doing a summary is to pretend you're explaining to a friend what the source was about, and you only have 1 minute to do it. The key is to put the material in your own words and then give credit to the author. Method 2, paraphrase. A second tool for handling material and avoiding the perils of plagiarism is to paraphrase. It's very similar to a summary. However, the length of paraphrase does not need to be shorter than the original source. Again, you need to put the author's ideas into your own words, but also give credit to the author. Do not copy the structure or wording of the source. Let's look at another example from Mary Lou Considine's Climate Change Will Force the Relocation of Animal Species. In an earlier collaboration, Professor Hughes was involved in developing a broad risk assessment framework for policymakers and conservation agencies that begins with more conventional options for conserving species. Now let's look at one possible paraphrase. To help various organizations make an informed decision, Professor Hughes has examined the issue by looking at less extreme measures. Considine. Notice that the paraphrase captures the meaning of the material, but does not use the structure or the words of the source. Method number 3, quotation. Perhaps the simplest way to avoid the ire of your professor and his wrath is to simply quote a source. We'll go into the specifics of how to quote in depth later, but the process for now is relatively simple. All you have to do is to introduce the author and then state the quote. Consider this example from Fred Warmington's Warming Up the Orb. Source: Fred Warmington, page 64 from the book Warming Up the Orb. Climate change does not always mean that the atmosphere and the earth is warming. It can also describe a process. Here's one way to quote the author effectively. According to Fred Warmington, quote, climate change does not always mean that the atmosphere and the earth is warming. It can also mean a process. Page 64. Note that the author is introduced in the sentence. This gives the credit to the author and keeps your project safe from being accused of plagiarism.